It's Leslie Simon, and this is a new episode of Desperate for Attention.
Leslie Simon, I'm so glad you called. So glad. I'm so ready to talk about
I know.
what it is we have planned to talk today, which I think a thing that a lot of our listeners might be pretty interested to hear about.
I hope they're pretty interested to hear about it. I'm pretty excited to talk about it. This is an episode that you and I have been super pumped to do since the podcast was but a glimmer in our eye. And what we're going to dig into today is the question that we get posed so much, which is, Yo, Chris, how do I get a book deal?
How does one write a book? Well, you go to OpenAI. Haha, that's a joke now.
Womp, womp,
Yes. So
womp.
we wanted to do an episode where we give a lot of firsthand experience about how we got our book deals and really just pay it forward and talk about what the industry's like, the publishing industry, because it can be very opaque, can feel difficult to know what's going on if you're not already on the inside. And honestly, I wasn't, even though I had been a working journalist for over 5 years when I wrote my book, I didn't know a lot of what was on the inside of the publishing industry when I got my deal. So now having a few years to look back on my book, I was really in a frame of mind to give some advice and just give myself some advice on what the whole process was like.
I am excited for us to share our experiences, which are really unique and different from each other's. And that reflects our books as well. Yours being an oral history, the book that I wrote with Trevor Kelly, that was more nonfiction, a little bit more snark with illustrations versus yours had photography. So I think you could not get two more similar topics and more different approaches to those topics, which should make for really interesting, captivating, unprecedented conversation about how we got our emo book deals.
Staring at the blank page before you, open up the dirty window, let the sun illuminate the words that you could not find. Reaching for something in the distance, so close you can almost taste it. Release your inhibitions, feel the rain on your skin. No one else can feel it for
So similar, yet ever different. That's us,
I know.
Leslie. That's us
It's
too.
true. It's true.
So we broke things up into four stages when we planned out our chat over the weekend. And
Yep.
I think it would be good for the listeners for us to take it step by step, chronologically. Let's begin at the genesis of our
Mm,
book.
mm.
How we got the idea for our books, really everything up until starting to actually do the book. So the idea phase, the ideas percolating. What was that phase like for you, Leslie?
Wow. Wow, 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 wow. You know, I was going through my archives because believe it or not, I do have a lot of boxes with drafts of different manuscripts and documents and press and a lot of things that cost big bucks to move from flat rate moving across the country, but were well worth keeping because it was so fun to take a trip in the Wayback Machine and look at some of the files that I kept over the years. And while I do not have a specific date that I could pinpoint to when the idea for Everybody Hurts happened, I do have a pretty distinct memory of it being around 2005, 2006. And at the time, a lot of my peers in the music writing space were getting book deals, and I was a very competitive little worker bee. So, of course, oh, you're doing that? Well, I need to do that too. So I start brainstorming different ideas that I think are going to turn the world on fire, and they did not. And people would tell me, thanks for playing, but it's not me, it's you. Uh, not good ideas. And I remember a book on my parents' bookshelf called The Preppy Handbook. It was actually a book that came out in October of 1980, written by Jonathan Roberts, Carol. McD Wallace, Mason Wiley, and Lisa Birnbach, the official Preppy Handbook. And I remember reading it when I was younger, probably when I was a teen, and thinking that it was pretty funny. Not entirely understanding all of the references to it, but knowing that it was satire.
Hmm.
It was,
Your parents' beach house on Cape Cod, where
oh,
they
sure,
kept
sure,
their
sure, sure.
copy.
Yes, that's exactly right. And when the Kennedys gave it back because they had borrowed it over the weekend, I thought, wouldn't this be something interesting to apply to this burgeoning underground but soon to be ubiquitous emo culture? And I probably sent that idea off to a couple trusted confidants, and they said, this is not terrible, which I took as very high praise and immediately started scribbling down what could be chapter headings or segments of ideas. And it started to take shape pretty fast in my head, at least. And at the time of this brainstorm, I reached out to my friend Sarah Lewitton, aka Ultra Girl from Spin Magazine, who had just either landed her deal or published her book, The Pocket DJ. And I said, hey, I happen to have this thing that I'm thinking about. Do you have anybody in publishing that maybe I could run this past to see if it's viable and if there's any legs to it? She said, yeah, sure, talk to my agent. So I reached out to the agent, and without completely showing my hand, I said, hey, I've got this idea, and here's where, here's who I am, and here's what I do, and here's what I like. And they liked enough of what I was saying that they wanted to set a meeting with me. So I went to New York and took a meeting. I lied about having a book proposal mostly finished. I had not started. I did not know I needed one, and had a really successful meeting where they said, this is something that we think we can sell. You need to obviously flesh it out more and decide the presentation of it. And I know you and I talked about this for your book, but the comments that stuck with me the most were towards the end of the meeting when they said, this is really a lot of work for one person to do. And we think that it would be a really good idea for you to bring someone else into the writing process to help shoulder that burden. And of course, me being the plucky go-getter that I was at the time, was like, no, 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 I can handle it. No big deal. And they're like, no, no, no. We also just want to really make sure that there's a male point of view captured, and we worry that you might not be able to do that. To which, of course, being the plucky go-getter, I was like, oh my God, of course, totally, no problem. I'll do whatever you want. Only later in therapy did I realize that maybe that was a bunch of horse shit. But at the time, I was a good little soldier, followed my orders, and as I was walking out of the meeting, I remember practically skipping down the street, and I dialed Trevor Kelly and I just screamed at him, probably like, do you want to write a book with me? And he probably said something like, yeah, sure, why not? And that was the start of what would become Everybody Hurts, an essential guide to emo culture, which would have ended up being released in April of 2007. But during the drafting and proposal process, it was in fact billed as I Second That Emotion, which we decided to abandon later. But that's what we sold, and that's what we charted out in our proposal. And that was the start of a really exciting, nonstop, crazy, strenuous, exhilarating, debilitating journey. How does that compare to your inception of Where Are Your Boys Tonight, Chris Payne?
So I was also at a publication full time when I first got the idea for my book. I was at Billboard. I was their rock and indie industry person on staff as a writer. And I wrote an oral history on Panic at the Disco's first album, A Fever You Can't Sweat Out, for the 10th anniversary of it. That was in 2015. I interviewed Brandon Urie, Pete Wentz, the whole gang about A Fever You Can't Sweat Out. And it was a lot of fun. It was my first oral history, but it really came naturally to me, and I really loved the whole process. It got a really good response online. It was a project that I totally pitched on my own. No editor gave it to me.
You know what? It's almost like hearing what you're saying, almost 10 years exactly from the time that Everybody Hurts started taking shape to the time that Where Are Your Boys Tonight started taking shape. And that, I wonder if that also kind of mirrors our trajectories. Like, because when did you start really like getting your name out, having a byline, working at Billboard?
Oh, well, I started interning for them in fall of 2011, and
Mhm.
I had bylines there pretty much from the get-go. And the
Because I
first
started at AP in summer of 2001.
decade,
Wow. Okay, so we're like 10 years apart,
yeah, and a
which was so
seat.
crazy because I started when I was 13. So I was just such a prodigy. So go on. Yes, so
Yeah, so
you published the,
got
yep.
more bylines, was became staff 2013, worked my way up to doing stuff in the magazine, doing bigger features, pitching my own bigger projects, etc. That's how I wound up with the Panic at the Disco oral history on billboards.com. A couple years later, I did an oral history of the 2005 Warp Tour. This was because it was Warp Tour's final year. They had just embarked on the 2018 tour. That was when Kevin Lyman was retiring it, and I wanted to do a big online feature to mark that occasion. This one took a few months to do because after doing the first one, I had an idea of the time it takes and how if you give yourself more time to reach out to people and kind of let people come to you, it just makes for a better story rather than imposing yourself with a tight deadline on a story that's so dependent on access. So over a few months, I did interviews for this, and I wound up interviewing about 2 dozen people for it, including Kevin Lyman, who I remember came into the office. I brought in my program from 2005, which I still had with me. And so, yeah, talked to him, talked to like the Rejects, Motion City Soundtrack, bands you were very much friends with. I talked to Al, one of the singers from the Dropkick Murphys. I had a pretty cool purview of people for this. Under Oath, Starting Line. I was also reading Meet Me in the Bathroom at the time, which had just come out. You know, the oral history of New York City underground, garage rock blowing up, the Strokes and all that. So just having Lizzie Goodman's style of doing oral history in my head and like reading the book as I was writing this and thinking like, how do they open a new scene? How do they create characters? How do they bridge from one topic to another using just quotes? Having this stuff fresh in my mind helped a lot. And I literally had that book on my desk with me through the whole time in my office at Billboard of writing that story in my cubicle. That did really well. And I could see the progress I'd made where I was like, oh, 3 years later doing this in 2018, I was like, I can see how I'm getting better at this. And there's an audience for this. You know, looking at the numbers on Chartbeat for the site, story did pretty well. I was psyched. And I wanted to make it into a book. I was like, the emo explosion of the late 90s and the aughts absolutely deserves a book. Oral history is the way that I want to tell it. I've done two of these that make sense that I think are good. I can totally write 30 something more of these and weave them together as a cohesive narrative. So that was the first time I had the idea to do the book. Only thing is, I had no idea how the publishing industry worked. I was busy with a day job, and it also probably would have been pretty odd for me to be trying to track down and interview all these people while they were also part of my beat for work, where I had to interview them for things for work. So it didn't go anywhere really. One night I remember coming home from work and threw together the beginning of a book proposal, and I fleshed it out over a few more days. Like I looked up online the parts of a book proposal, started to put together like a chapter list until 2020 when I got laid off during the pandemic, when Billboard was cost cutting. All of a sudden I needed a new main source of income, a new thing to drive me, and that became it.
I don't think we could have had different paths to the same center, but oh, to have not written a book while I had a full-time job would have been, I think I mean, it was meant to be the way it was meant to be. That I just had no life for 6 years. But I think there are pluses and minuses of it, and I completely understand why it would have gotten a little bit messy, for you to do that. I mean, that's how we both kind of came to our ideas for each of our books. I don't know if I actually mentioned it on the nose or on the head or on whatever part of the body. But I was working at Alternative Press during this time. So this was all on top of the work that I was doing. And I say that only to say that if I had not been working at AP, it would have been really difficult to show that expertise level needed to get a book deal. I think the same is true for you, Chris, right? Like just saying that you know a lot about a certain topic, the book proposal itself requires so much more than just, I know a lot. Let me write 65,000 words about it. But it was like a blessing and a curse at the same time. But definitely both of our experiences in magazine publishing ended up helping a ton in book publishing, which could not be more different from each other, even though they both have the word publishing in it.
Yeah, so much of writing the proposal, which we'll get to, so much of writing the proposal is not just about what's going to be inside the book, but how you're going to sell the book.
Right.
Basically, how is this publishing company going to make money off this book? How are they going to get people to spend $25 on it? How are they going to make those people aware the book exists? How are they going to reach them, convince them, etc.? And so much of it is you writing in that proposal. These are my contacts. These are people I know
Right.
who work at publications that cover books that could do interviews with me. Here's people I know who host podcasts who could have me on their podcast. Here's people who are celebrities who could just post about the book.
Right.
So much of the book proposal process is about selling it, and that is just one of the realities that I found out.
And what already exists that is potential competition or proof that there's interest in the topic that you're trying to build. And also, what makes your book unique as opposed to those existing titles that are either already out in the marketplace or about to be out in the marketplace and pre Everybody Hurts. There were not a ton of emo books out. I mean, really, it was like Nothing Feels Good from Andy Greenwald, and that was kind of it. That was really the only word on the street, which was good because it didn't show that there was a ton of competition. I think that the publisher probably would have said like the hipster handbook. That was maybe a little bit of a similar thing. Okay, so you have an idea, Chris. I have an idea. We both have a dream. What is the next step in our quest to become published book authors? It is putting a proposal together and crossing every appendage that we have that a publisher will tell us they want our idea and they want to make it into a book. It's getting a book deal by a publishing house. That is not to say that it isn't possible to self-publish, right? That is a very viable and can be very lucrative way to get your idea published. That does not happen to be our personal experience. Something that I think it's important just to acknowledge, but unfortunately, we can't really speak a whole lot to it. Um, but this just represents the way that we found a way forward with our ideas. But it's not the only way. It just happens to be how we did it.
Yeah, on that note, real quick, I'm going to shout out a very good self-published book on emo. It's called Posts, and it's by the writer Eric Grubbs. Check that one out. It covers the era from the beginning of the mid 80s and the Discord record stuff up until kind of around the era of your book, Leslie, up until
Mhm.
'07, but it doesn't really dive into the popular
Hmm.
MTV stuff too much. It focuses on bands like Jawbreaker, The Promise Ring, At the
Right,
Drive-In. So
right.
yeah, if you're looking for more self-published emo book stuff, check out Post by Eric Grubbs. But yeah,
Get
I
it.
read that one during the making of my book, and it's very helpful
Nice.
for research.
I will add it to my my list of things to read for sure.
If you could say yourself. You could save us all. Go on living, prove us wrong. You live with faith, could be a well-timed smile. Survival never goes out of style.
So let's dig a little bit into the deal, the art of the deal.
All right, selling. Yeah, yeah. You tell us how you sold emo, Leslie.
Oh, wow. After my meeting with Jim Fitzgerald and his assistant, but also second in command, Anne Garrett, who also represented Sarah Lewitton, Andy Greenwald, Mark Spitz, a variety of other kind of music journalists of the time. I got to working on a book proposal, which was based on all of the great things I learned from books at the library about how to write a really great book proposal. And it was kind of as simple as that in the sense of I followed the formula and the template that so many people had done before me and continue to do after me slash us because Trevor came into the process towards the end of the proposal, I think. I think he came in, yeah, towards the end of the proposal because the proposal draft that I found, I wrote in change all the my's and I's to we's and ours. So I think that I started without him and then he joined soon thereafter. Like Chris mentioned in the proposal, it included more than just what we thought we would write about in the book. It included our author biography, what makes us experts in this field, how are we going to sell the book, what are the contacts we have in media, are you a member of associations? Are you willing to do press? Are you willing to do panels? Are you willing to give lectures? Once you sell the book, how will you continue to support it? What are the specifications? How long is this book? How are you going to organize it? Are you going to have imagery? Will there be illustrations? Will there be photography? All of the really nitty-gritty details of publishing a book. I think just really like pie in the sky hopes and dreams for how you would like to see it promoted, how you would like to see it disseminated. For Everybody Hurts at the time, we were also very open and wanting to use our networks of touring as well. This wasn't just a bookstore book. This wasn't just a Barnes and Noble title. This was something that we wanted to sell at shows and Warped Tour and Bamboozle. And we saw a lot of potential in untraditional places like Hot Topic. So that was something that we put in our proposal to show that this was a unique book, a unique audience, but a very loyal audience at that. And if you build it, they will come. So we wanted to let people at the publishing house who were probably not used to this type of proposed promotion to feel like they could trust the input and the feedback from us because we knew what we were talking about. And we were going to do everything that we could to make this as big as it could be. And of course, we got very lucky that we ended up going with HarperCollins, who was a part of the Murdoch massive News Corp conglomerate, which had acquired MySpace for just somewhere upwards of, I think, 580 million. No big deal, pocket change, but that as its own acquisition seemed like a really great way to take a somewhat antiquated industry of book publishing and introduce it to a younger, hipper, tech-savvy audience, which also benefited the book. So that's my waxing poetic on book proposals. But because I am old and decrepit, some of my dates are a little wonky in the oatmeal of my brain. But I believe that we put the proposal together in just a few weeks. There was a 24-hour period where it went to market, and I probably bit all of my nails and like developed trichotillomania and was like pulling all of my hair out because you are getting real-time updates from your agent. Like, we sent it to X houses, however many houses, let's say 10, and three are out. So then that leaves seven. Okay, one is in. It's like this.
Mhm.
And then we had it down to three houses. Then they all come in at their offers. Then you have to, use one offer to go against the other offer. And I feel like it got down to HarperCollins and maybe Simon and Schuster, but don't quote me on that. Given the MySpace acquisition, it was really hard to come to the table with anything that would have been close to the reach of promotion and advertising of MySpace. So we ended up going there. I can say that it is probably getting that book deal is the proudest moment of my professional and personal life. And I will be forever grateful to have someone like Trevor to go through that process with me because writing can be a really solitary endeavor. And to have somebody to look next to you who's going through the same thing, to be able to like look back later to be like, oh my God, can you believe we did that? Or oh my gosh, can you believe that? Like, there's someone there that has very similar memories of that time. So that was kind of the start of the next leg of the race because it really is a marathon. It's like a sprint and a marathon at the same time. So I will wait to go into more of the book writing process and pass the baton over to Chris to let the people know how you went from idea then to signing on the dotted line.
So, what really got things going for me was a call with Lizzie Goodman. So, I don't know if she even remembers this, but Lizzie, who, as we mentioned before, wrote Meet Me in the Bathroom, she was a big inspiration on my book idea for this emo oral history. In the early stages of when I was looking to write this book, just maybe like 3 weeks, 4 weeks after getting laid off from Billboard, this was like, peak pandemic, late April of 2020. I got put in touch with her by a mutual friend who I asked, and Lizzie was nice enough to hop on the phone and chat with me for like 45 minutes. I had a bunch of questions for her. She answered a lot of questions, gave me advice. One of the big takeaways was that there really isn't one set of rules for this. And what I mean by that is I was sitting there thinking, oh my God, am I allowed to do interviews yet? I haven't gotten an agent yet. I need an agent to get the book deal, to get a publisher. Is that when I start doing interviews? Can I start writing the book now? Is that bad? Lizzie broke it down and she was like, there's no real rules to this. You should
And
absolutely be
no order in which to proceed.
you should absolutely be doing interviews now and working on the book and also reaching out to agents. That is who will get you your book deal. She did tell me that you probably don't want to come to agents with a book that's just already done. And it's like, hey, you want to put out my book for me? Because agents and then your publisher, they want to have some skin in the game. They obviously want to feel part of this, that it was something they helped along. So work on the book, don't finish the book, but keep doing interviews, keep reaching out to people. She's like, that's great. They're gonna like to see that you're already hard at this, but reach out to agents. Agents is who will get the ball rolling. And she was nice enough to put me in touch with her agent, which wasn't at the time connected to the same set of connections that put her book out on Day Street Books. But I did get put in touch with someone who was currently working with her agent through the grapevine. So that turned into my first connection of an agent who was interested, which was phenomenal. And also just getting time on the phone, just hearing Lizzie's voice, lending all this experience, that gave me so much confidence that this could be a real thing that could come together. Because this was like 2020 and the pandemic when like no one was leaving their house. Vibes were strange. And it was really big for her to reach out for me and to help me out like that. So from there, I just started doing more interviews. The first interview I had done for my book was Gabe Saporta. That was on May 5th, 2020. The second was Rob Hitt, the drummer from Midtown. And Rob, being the kind person and social butterfly and record label owner on the side that he is, he had a lot of contacts. So really Rob and then me tapping into all the people like managers and publicists who I knew from my time at Billboard, they really set the tree growing of interview after interview leading into another set of interviews. So on the agent side of actually getting the book together to get the business side going, what I learned is that you are much more likely to get put in touch with an agent through a published author than anything else. For me, I was lucky that from working in journalism, I had contacts with Lizzie and a couple other people. For if someone out there who's listening is like looking to do this and doesn't know in their life any published authors, that's fine. I would just say seek out authors you like, books similar to yours, books that just inspire you, people who give you the vibe that they would help with something, and reach out. I think I mean, you're obviously it's going to be kind of a low batting average in how many cold responses you get, but I think you might be pleasantly surprised in how many authors respond because they're often going to understand how hard this business is to break into and want to help out someone. Of course, especially if their idea is good, that still goes a long way. So I will say that I sent out maybe like 15 cold pitches to agents. You could probably still find this online, but there's some article of listing all the major agencies and emails, contacts with them. I went through every one, specified it towards the agent at each agency who seemed most relevant to a book on emo, sent them out. It was literal crickets. Heard nothing back from all of those cold pitch agencies. The got two other agencies got interested in Where Are Your Boys Tonight. One of them was through another author who I know. It was Marissa Moss who wrote the book Her Country, which is really awesome. It's a book about women revolutionizing country music like Casey Musgraves in the 20th century. I had chatted with her for her book, so we knew each other from that, and I reached out, and that turned into a connection. And then a second person who was interested just came through one of my interviews, which is the one I wound up going with. Basically, I was interviewing someone who currently worked for Paradigm Talent Agency because they were an agent who was in the emo scene back in the aughts. Before we even got to chatting about my book, they were like, "Oh, this is interesting. We're looking to, we also have an arm of Paradigm that represents authors, and which I didn't even know. I hadn't even pitched them. And to make a long story short, they wound up becoming my agent because we hit it off chatting. I wanted to suss out, these people also represent a lot of artists in the book. Is that going to make things weird? Is it going to get in the way? We had several conversations. Things were to my liking. It felt like the best pick. And I made the leap and picked them. And one thing I will say, if you are fortunate enough to be giving no's to agents you choose not to go with, I learned from it that making phone calls to say no, which I did do, was definitely the right decision. Maybe it's a little bit awkward to pick up the phone and be like, "Hey, thanks so much, but like I'm going with someone else." Definitely do it because both people who I reached out and said thanks, but no thanks to, they were like, "Thank you for calling. I appreciate it." You'd be surprised how many people just send an email. So that is my advice. Definitely be nice to people and have the decency to call them. Be nice. Just for some other background on this kind of stuff, you typically don't really sign anything or enter any official partnership until they sell your book. And that's when you sign stuff, and typically 15% is what agents take these days for a book deal. So I partnered up officially with Paradigm towards the end of 2020. I remember over Thanksgiving break being home and finalizing my book proposal. They gave me some advice, some things to tweak on that, and got it all together and we pitched. It's funny. The book was originally supposed to go out to editors on January 6th, 2021. And at like 10 a.m., my agent Alyssa emailed me and she was just like, "Yeah, so I'm sure you see what's going on in the world today. It's probably not the best time to send out a query on a book about emo from 2005." So we waited till the next week, and it took a little bit of time to get some people interested. I remember we sent out to about 15 different publishers, and we picked like the most relevant person. So like if there was a music person or like a pop culture nonfiction person, we would send it to that person. at each publisher. The first five or six were no's. They tend to be very polite in kind of like a formulaic, stilted way, but no's nonetheless. And Day Street was the first one who got back to me, the editor Matthew Dodonna, who was interested. So, what happens when an editor at a publisher is interested is typically your agent organizes a call with you and the editor there, and the your agent is also on the call in the background, basically being the organizer of the call, going back and forth. So I did that with Day Street and one other publisher. When all is said and done, it was two publishing houses that were interested. So, like you said, Leslie, on your very nervous day when everything went down, it's organized by your agent, the bidding process. For me, it was just one afternoon where my agent, Alyssa, basically just hosted a chat between the two publishing houses that were going back and forth bidding. Finally, one bid more than the other, and the other didn't bid. Alyssa was like, "Which one do you want to go with?" And I said Day Street, and I was very happy because Day Street was the one who I wanted to go with all along, and it worked out really fortuitously. It really, really did. It was when I was pitching the book from back when I was at Billboard, when I was like, doing that Warped Tour oral history and reading Meet Me in the Bathroom, that was the publisher that put out Meet Me in the Bathroom, and that was the one that I had in my mind that I really wanted to work with. So it was pretty incredible how that came together. And if memory serves, within the next day, the contract was finalized. I remember one thing that had to be sussed out was the payment plan. Typically, editor for authors out there, you want to be paid by your publisher in three parts, not four parts. A three-part payment these days, from what I understand, is like the more usual way of being paid. So it's being paid a third when you sign your deal, the second third when you hand in your manuscripts, and the final third of your advance when the book actually comes out. What they did was they originally proposed it spread apart in four things. So like the fourth part would have been even later on. And just for an example of something that got sussed out in the bargaining process, that was moved into three payments, which is better for the author, getting paid sooner. So things like that are what the agency can do for you, what your agent can do for you. And like I said, you're paying them probably 15%. So they work for you and they can help you do things like that. So that was how I signed my deal in January of 2021, and I was off to the races. 18 months was the time frame that I gave myself to write the book. And would it get done in 18 months? Would it not?
Hmm.
Would it get pushed back? To be continued.
Yeah, I wish that I remembered more about the days slash weeks following all of that. I do remember my parents' friends who were a lawyer looked at the contracts, and that is also something I would recommend, is having a second set of very experienced eyes look through those contracts. They are not intended for normal people to understand, and they're pretty turnkey. I mean, there's not a whole lot of crazy stuff in there, but it's still worth. I mean, for me, I was 26, 25, 26. I didn't know my ass from my elbow. So I really was happy to have somebody else look through it with me and kind of guide me and Trevor through that process. I feel like I'm sure that it was a three payment plan, but part of me also thinks it was two, but I don't think it was two. It must have been three. We did also have, sometimes they'll try to sweeten the pot by saying, if you recoup this amount of your advance within this time frame, we'll give you an extra X amount of dollars. But that's imaginary money. So that might make the publishing decision sound a lot sweeter, but that's not money that you can bank on. That's just potential money that you have. But if you don't sell that many books, then you don't get that money. I also just wanted to go back, Chris, to what you were saying about manuscripts and how much you should have done, and agree with you that you should not have the whole book done. I also want to offer the footnote that there is a different set of rules and best practices if you write fiction than if you write nonfiction. And with fiction, as I've been told, you do want to have a
Yeah.
manuscript completely written because houses and agents are very concerned with plagiarism, and so should authors, but they do not want to look at ideas or half manuscripts. They want to see something that's a complete entity so that they cannot be sued or accused of taking any ideas that were not fully baked. Now, I can't speak for present tense nonfiction book proposals or deals, but as you have, anyone who's listening to this has heard from the last half hour or so between me and Chris, like I did not have any part of my book written before I sold the book. It was based on an idea. And the best thing that your first book can do is help sell the second book. And that idea of selling a concept, but being very detailed in how you imagine that concept shaking out on the page. The more detailed that you can get in your proposal, in your chapter overview, the better. Not only does that offer a skeleton for you putting pen to paper and writing the book itself, it's less research, less work you have to do while you're writing because you've already spent that time prepping, but it shows a proof of concept and a proof of success to anyone who wants to continue that relationship with you, knowing that you delivered on the first book. They're going to trust you more for the second and with the third and things like that. You might not always get bigger and bigger deals because the fiscal environment of publishing is a very dynamic one and the price of goods goes up and down. And what might have been a big book deal advance in 2000 might not be the same. It's all relative and you're building something, right? So like if you don't get what you think you should or hope you should with the first book, that all helps towards your next idea and book is in the future.
Yeah, Leslie, I'm glad you brought up fiction because I feel like a lot of our listeners are interested in fiction and maybe write fiction themselves. The big difference between the proposal and nonfiction, as you said, is fiction they want to see a lot, usually the whole book written beforehand before they decide what they're going to do with it. Whereas
For
for not
for a first time author, I would
yeah,
say especially,
yeah.
right? Like they're not going to take an unproven quantity based on an idea. For a first time fiction writer, I would not expect to have anything less than a full manuscript done before you send it. And you have to check and see who will accept unsolicited manuscripts because if you're trying to go through an agent and they don't accept it, you're essentially putting a lot of yourself out there to just go kind of like in a spam folder, which sucks, but that's the truth of it.
Yeah, and as far as nonfiction with writing the whole book or how much to write ahead of time, what they typically look for is one chapter as a sample chapter in your proposal. For me, because I was writing an oral history book that was entirely contingent on interviews, many of which I had not done yet during the proposal process, what they accepted in lieu of a sample chapter was basically a set of highlights from the interviews I had done so far. So at that point, I had actually done a decent amount of the bigger names. I hadn't interviewed like Mikey or Pete Wentz yet, but I interviewed about 40 people. I mentioned Gabe Saporta, I had Travis McCoy in there, I had Andrew McMahon in there, I had Max Bemis in there, people like that, and also some smaller names, but who had really interesting quotes. A couple pages of their best of quotes was what took the place of my sample chapter in my proposal.
Sit tight, I'm gonna need you to keep time. Come on, just snap, snap, snap your fingers for me. Good, good, now we're making some progress. Come on, just tap, tap, tap your toes to the beat. And I believe this may call for a proper introduction. Well, don't you?
Chris, before we dive into even more detail behind how our books were written. Now that we're at the phase where the deal is done, the signatures are signed, the time frame is determined. For your book, you said it was 18 months. I feel like for everybody hurts, it was crazy. Something like we signed the deal in winter of 2006 and it was due in fall 2006 to be published in spring 2007. It was like a crazy 6 month sprint so that we could get up and running as fast as possible. But this feels like a good place to maybe press pause, stretch our legs, come back and dive into even more aspects of the book writing process because this is a really juicy topic and I think it's almost too much for one episode. So let's do another one. If you are not following Desperate for Attention on socials, what are you doing? Do it already. You can find us on Instagram at Desperate for Attention Pod. Same handle goes for YouTube. If you're on the YouTube, follow us, subscribe, put your notifications on. We're going to be posting a lot of videos in the coming weeks. And thank you for listening to Desperate for Attention on whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. You can find us, like I said, at Desperate for Attention Pod. New episodes every Wednesday. And please share with your friends. Tell anybody you know that you like the podcast and rate us, follow us, subscribe to us, comment, send us presents, whatever you feel is right. We are excited to continue this conversation next week.
Part two, same time, same place. Desperate for attention next week. We'll catch you guys later.
Bye.